I was trying to figure out how long ago the first meeting that I was at with Ocular, we started to realise that there was no guidance about how patients should be looked after. It must be 5 or 6 years ago, I think. 6. The UK guidelines came from a discussion at this meeting, and they're not perfect, but they provide a benchmark that we can build upon to try and improve outcomes. What I'm going to talk about are trials for metastatic uveal melanoma. So I know that some of you will have insights into this and some of you won't. Some of you perhaps have been recently diagnosed and are fearful of a future that may result in advanced disease, and that may never happen. There's a whole mix of experience here. So I'm going to try and take you through it as gently as I can, but there will be some data slides. And as a medical oncologist, I'm a firm believer that it's the evidence that we need to generate to justify treatments that we can have some confidence in. And without that, it's all anecdotal, and we don't really know whether or not we're doing anybody any good. So what I'm planning on doing is just to take you through the drugs that are currently licensed and available and used for melanoma and used for uveal melanoma, and I'll show you how unfortunately bad they are, because I think it's important that you know that before thinking about why clinical trials are important. I mean, to put it the other way, if you had treatments that were highly successful in almost everybody, there would be little need to do clinical trials to find new treatment. But because treatments for uveal melanoma are so poor once it's spread, I'd say there's a massive need to generate improvements, and the only way to do that in a robust way is with clinical trials. Now we'll just see if this works. We haven't tested it yet. Doesn't. Next slide. Thanks. Okay, so many of you will be aware that for skin melanoma, one of the major advances over the last few years has been with drugs which turn on the immune system to fight the disease. And that's attractive for all sorts of reasons. And the drugs that are currently out there and are licensed for the treatment of skin melanoma are up there. It's a drug called ipilimumab that we've been using for about a decade, and then 2 newer drugs, pembrolizumab and nivolumab. And they all hit targets on the immune system that turn on, that allow the immune system to be turned on against the cancer. Next slide. So in skin melanoma, we've got long-term follow-up data with ipilimumab, and this is a survival curve, and it's a survival curve of a few trials that have all been lumped together. And unfortunately, each time this curve comes down, a patient has died. So you could see that at 2 years, 85% of patients have died. Okay, so that's pretty awful. But the interesting thing about this curve is this flat bit, because if you're alive and well at 3 years, you're almost guaranteed to be alive at well at 5 years, and you're almost guaranteed to be alive at well at 10 years. So because we've been using this drug for a while, we know that if you turn on the immune response in the right way for skin melanoma, patients can have long-term durable benefit. And this is only after 4 treatments over a 3-month period. And then these patients are still alive 10 years later. And the old survival curves for this disease, only 5% were alive at 5 years. So this was the first sense we had that these drugs could make an impact. Next slide. Now, the other drugs I mentioned, nivolumab and pembrolizumab, hit a different target on the immune system, but works in a similar way. It helps release the immune system to fight the cancer. And you can see in this trial, nivolumab was much better than dacarbazine, a chemotherapy drug. Next slide. And we do things like adding 2 drugs together. So this is the combination of the first drug I mentioned and the second drug. So ipilimumab plus nivolumab compared to nivolumab alone, compared to ipilimumab alone. And 2 drugs are better than 1 drug. Okay. So that's where we are with skin melanoma. And you can see that, you know, up to 40% perhaps of patients are going to have significant longer-term benefit, we think, from this for skin melanoma. Now, the problem is with eye melanoma, it's entirely different. So if you put the next slide up, Now, clinical trials with eye melanoma are very difficult, partly because it's so rare, and you can't easily do a study where you get hundreds of patients together or thousands of patients together. And so when you look at outcomes in trials for uveal melanoma, quite often it's very small patient groups. And you have to, and so what people do is report what they've done at their own centres. There are a few trials here. Now, I know this table won't project well, but I'm just going to give you some bottom lines. You see the intervention here, a lot of this is ipilimumab. There's a pembrolizumab one, there's a nivolumab there. And the sample size, this is the number of patients, 13, 11, 10, 22, 10. So very small numbers of patients in each of these. There's this larger one here, 75. So I'm the senior author on this one with Dirk Schadendorf. This is 75 patients treated with nivolumab as part of a larger study. Now, unfortunately, the overall response rate, so this is patients who've had some tumour shrinkage, is 3%, 5%, 5.8%. This one's 30%, but there are only 10 patients. So there's a problem with a small trial. You only need, by chance, to have 1 or 2 patients in your 10 patients, and suddenly you go from 5% to 20%. But it doesn't really mean anything. And you have to look at the trials altogether, because the overall response rates are all in the 5% mark. And then progression-free survival. So that's, you can roughly take that as the time it takes before the cancer grows. Okay? So the time to take before the cancer grows, you're looking at about 3 months. So that tells you that you're not having a major effect on the growth of the cancer with these drugs. So you can see there's a huge difference between the very marked benefit that patients with skin melanoma are getting from these sorts of treatments and the very minimal benefit that the majority of patients with uveal melanoma are getting from these drugs. Now, these are all single-agent studies. Next slide. Just recently, a Spanish group in the summer presented outcomes with 19 patients treated with the 2 drugs together, the ipilimumab and nivolumab. And they had 15% of patients who had some shrinkage. And it was about 5 months before the cancer started growing. On average, these are medians, so you have patients who do worse than that and better than that. So there may be a hint that 2 drugs are better than 1 drug for uveal melanoma, but it's still 85% of patients who don't have significant shrinkage. Okay? So moving on. So that's the immunotherapy data in a broad nutshell. I'm trying to take you through where we are with current drugs before we go on to what the trials are doing. Where we are with another current treatment, which is hepatic saturation, Delcath. There's a tube that gets put into the hepatic artery and you infuse the liver with chemotherapy. Again, there's been lots of hype, I would suggest, but the data is really, really inadequate. So with this Delcath technique, in the phase 1 study, 10 melanoma patients were treated, and there were 3 responders and 2 complete responders. That sounds quite good, but we don't know about duration of response. We've got initial reports of duration response out to 7 or 8 months with these, but not longer than that. There were only 4 uveal melanoma patients in their phase 2 studies, so 4, you just not enough patients to be able to say anything sensible about. And then they really messed up with their phase 3 study, in which they wanted to treat 40-odd patients with Delcath and 40-odd patients with best supportive care. And what happened was that after patients who had progressed on best supportive care, if they were fit enough, they went on to Delcath. And they reported the study as saying there was an 11-month benefit in patients who crossed over from best supportive care to Delcath. So their overall survival median was 15 months compared to 4 months of the patients who didn't cross over. And therefore they say in the paper, 11 months survival benefit. And it's nonsense, because of course you have to be fit enough to cross over. So if you're not fit enough to cross over, you didn't go into this group, and therefore, by definition, those patients are going to do worse than the patients who were fit enough to cross over and get another treatment. And it's that sort of lack of robustness over the data that I and my colleagues feel really strongly about is a major problem when you're looking at small numbers. You've got to do clinical trials, otherwise you leap to the wrong conclusions. And people get given poor advice, like you must go and have Delcath somewhere. Might be right for an individual patient, but not because of this sort of data. Okay. Next slide. There was a better quality, actually, Siegel Institution experience reported this summer, 29 patients treated, 11 of them were uveal melanoma patients. The response rate was 33%. Median progression-free survival was 117 days, overall survival 261 days, still less than a year. Okay, so you can see this is a really difficult to treat disease, and feeding into the argument I'm putting to you that clinical trials are so important against this background. Okay, next slide. So with that introduction, I'm going to focus on the trials that are currently available in the UK. And the trials, broadly, there's a Delcath trial. There are 2 trials with this drug that I haven't yet mentioned, and there's 1 trial with this drug that I haven't yet mentioned. So we'll go through it now. Next slide. So this is a Delcath study. I'm grateful to Matt Wheater from Southampton, who gave me the details of this yesterday. So this is Delcath, so it's a hepatic chemoperfusion versus physician's choice alternative care. So patients are randomized either to receive the Delcath or to receive this alternative treatment. Choice of their doctor, either chemoembolization in the liver or the immunotherapies I've shown you, ipilimumab and pembrolizumab, or chemotherapy, but they're not allowed the combination of the 2 drugs that I mentioned. To be eligible for the study, they've got to have up to 50% of their liver involved, but not more than that. And also, remember, this is just a local treatment. This isn't a whole body treatment. The thing about cancers is that even cancer like uveal melanoma, which spreads to the liver first, it does move to other places. All cancers move to other places. And as a medical oncologist, I tend to think of systemic treatment, kind of whole body treatment, because I think of it as a whole body problem for most patients most of the time. But there are patients who have disease that is predominantly localized in the liver. And for this study, if there is extrahepatic disease, it's got to be limited to one organ. There's only got to be a maximum of 2 lesions, and they can't be big. They've got to be up to 2 centimeters, no more than that. And the logic of that is if you're going to give a local treatment, you want to give it to patients where the vast majority of the disease is present locally and not, which means that you're not treating a whole load of cancer that's outside the liver. No previous intrahepatic treatments allowed, but they are allowed to have had previous systemic treatment or ablation, things like radiofrequency ablation. So what you'll see from all of the trials I'm mentioning is that all trials have inclusion and exclusion criteria, because the people who are designing the study are trying to get a cohort of patients whose outcome they can interpret. And so you need to have some control over which patients are being exposed to the drug. Now, for an individual patient, that means navigating this trial landscape. You have to be quite strategic, and you need to get some advice. Because if you go into one trial, it may not allow you going into another trial. If you have one treatment outside a trial, it may not allow you to go and have another treatment within a trial, and I'll come back to that point. So this is going on at the moment. I think there's about 240 patients worldwide that are being randomized for this study. Next patient. That's the next patient. I'm glad the weekend's coming, I think. So. Okay, so this slide tells you about this new drug that I haven't mentioned. It's an immunotherapy drug, but it's entirely different from the sort of immunotherapy that I've shown you about before. So you can see from the current drugs, most patients with uveal melanoma are not going to have their immune system turned on in the way that we want it to fight the cancer from the data I've already shown you. This drug is entirely different, really, and you can think of it as a bridge between the immune system and the cancer. So one end of this is a bit of the drug that binds to the cancer. It's done in quite an interesting way for the scientific aficionados. It's a T-cell receptor that binds to a particular molecule, well, particular part of a molecule, a peptide, on the surface of uveal melanoma cells called GP100. But the bottom line is that this end sticks to the tumor. And then the other side of it, it's got something that sticks to lymphocytes, so T cells. And it doesn't just stick to the T cells, but it turns them on. So the idea is that this bridges between the tumor and the lymphocyte and brings the two together and also turns on the lymphocyte in the proximity of the tumor. So it's called IMC GP100, which tells you it's early on in development because it hasn't been given a name that sounds nice. Next slide. And this is some data that we presented in the summer from a study that we've been doing looking at finding the right dose and schedule for patients. Because with any new drug, you just need to find a dose that is tolerable and hopefully efficacious. And so in phase 1 trials, what you're trying to do is to find the appropriate dose that you can use to look in a wider cohort of patients. So there were 2 centres in the UK and I think 4 or 5 in the US. And these waterfall plots, each of these columns represents the tumour burden in an individual patient, normalised at 0. So in other words, if the column goes down, it means the cancer's shrunk. If the column goes up, the cancer's grown. So you can see that in this group of patients, we've had lots of patients who've had some tumour shrinkage. The minute you see that with uveal melanoma, everybody gets very interested because it's such a refractory disease to treat. These are called swimmer's plots. I don't know why there's a water theme, waterfall plots and swimmer's plots in medical oncology. I have no idea. But anyway, these are called swimmer's plots. What you can see, the first thing to see is this is going out to, that's a year or so there. So the first thing you can see is that there are some patients up here treated early on whose responses are still going on. So that's of interest. And you can see here the results from various scans they've had. So these are stable disease. The diamonds are partial responses. The circles are progressive disease. But some patients who have progressed have still had benefit after progression, which is quite interesting. Next slide. This is a slide from one of my patients. So pre-treatment and after 8 weeks of treatment, and you can see there's a lump there that you can't really see anymore. Next patient. Next slide. So there's a lump there that you can't see, and that one, in fact, is there. You can see it. You can see it on the films. But what's happened is it's become necrotic, and therefore it's become more visible, and it's shrunk on scan. So anyway, so patients have had responses. Next slide, please. So these are the studies that we're running at the moment. So this phase 1 study, because we've seen activity that we're very interested in, we're expanding it to larger groups of patients to get more information. The current, so there are 2 UK centres. There's my centre at Mount Vernon, and there's Joe Sacco and Ernie Marshall Centre in Clatterbridge. So this expansion phase at the moment, to get on it, you have to have had 1 previous treatment with a checkpoint inhibitor. Okay. Now, there's a planned amendment. So in other words, if you've had more than that, or if you haven't had treatment with an immune therapy, you're not allowed on the study. We've been having discussions with the drug company, and there is going to be an amendment that I hope will make this a bit more flexible. What I should have said at the outset, and forgive me for this, is that this drug only has the potential to work in patients who have an immune system of the right type. And broadly, you can think of this is the idea is similar to blood groups. So your immune system is not identical. Well, the immune system is not identical between us. That's why somebody's kidney that I receive won't will be rejected by my immune system because it recognizes it as being different if they're not matched. So our immune systems aren't all the same. And the drug has been designed to only work in for a particular type of immune system, which about half of us have. And this is the marker. It's like having a blood group marker, I suppose. But this is the marker. So about 50% of patients have this HLA-A2. It's a type of their immune system. And the drug will only potentially work in that group of patients. So in terms of eligibility for this trial, the first question we ask is a patient HLA-2 positive or not? And if they are, then they have to fulfill these other criteria before being considered. Okay. So this study is ongoing, and we're recruiting at the moment. There's quite tight restriction on entry, but I hope that's going to be loosened. There's also a registration phase 2 study with this, and this is where the licensing authorities, particularly the FDA in America, have said, okay, if you want this to be a standard of care, you've got to show that it's better than currently available treatment. And so it's a randomized study where patients either receive IMC GP100 or, again, they receive physician's choice, like the DELCATH study. And again, they're allowed single-agent checkpoint inhibitors, but they're not allowed the Ipi-Nivo combination together. And it's a 2-to-1 randomization. In other words, twice as many people get the IMC GP100 as get the best supportive care. But patients will not be allowed to switch over between one and the other. Okay, next patient. Next, God. I need a holiday. Okay, so covered DELCATH, covered IMC GP100. There's a third study that's going on with a drug called Selumetinib. Now, Selumetinib is not an immune therapy. It's a drug which targets a component of a growth factor pathway inside all cells, but which is activated inside many cancer cells. So it's something called a MEK inhibitor, so Selumetinib. And a mate of mine, Rich Carvajal in New York, did this study not too long ago, in which patients either received the standard of care at the time, which was chemotherapy with dacarbazine, or received Selumetinib. And you can see there's a big difference between the curves. In other words, in his trial, patients who received Selumetinib did significantly better than patients who had chemotherapy. And there was lots of interest at the time. In fact, I remember giving a talk here a few years ago about this forthcoming study. Lots of interest that Selumetinib may be helpful in this disease and be better than chemotherapy. Now, the drug company, AstraZeneca, went on to do a clinical trial, next slide, thanks, in which Selumetinib was combined with the chemotherapy. So they didn't do what Richard did. They didn't say, okay, well, let's do a bigger trial comparing Selumetinib against chemotherapy. What they did was to say, well, let's add Selumetinib with dacarbazine and test it against dacarbazine, so, which was different. And in fact, there wasn't much preclinical evidence, laboratory evidence, to suggest that that combination is a particularly active combination. So we've recently reported this. Next slide. And it was a negative study. So you can see the two curves are very close together. This is progression-free survival. This is a central review, so the scans were sent to blinded reviewers to have a look at, and there wasn't a significant difference between the two. These are the curves from the site-based review. In other words, the doctors who were running the study looked at the slides, and that there was a difference there, but the robust endpoint of the study is the central review, and there was no difference. So the question that we have is Selumetinib of any use, or was just this the wrong study? And we've got two studies. One's positive and one's negative, and so we still don't know. And there are differences between the two studies. So we're looking at that in a bit more detail. Next slide. With this study, CellPack. So this is taking Selumetinib and combining it with a different chemotherapy drug. It's a drug called paclitaxel. It's widely used for breast cancer and ovarian cancer. And the reason we're doing that is that we do have laboratory data showing that that particular drug, when combined with Selumetinib, is very active, or more active than Selumetinib on its own in laboratory experiments. And so what this study is doing is taking Selumetinib and looking at it either on its own or in combination with this chemotherapy drug, paclitaxel. Next study. Next slide, thank you. 123 patients in 13 centres. Next slide. So everybody gets Selumetinib. There's no placebo. Everybody gets Selumetinib. One group gets Selumetinib on its own. 2 other groups get Selumetinib with chemotherapy, and there's a subtle difference between these 2 chemotherapy arms in which the Selumetinib is stopped for a couple of days around the chemotherapy administration, because again, there's some laboratory data saying that may be helpful, and we want to test that, whether that's the case. Next slide. So we're looking at PFS, progression-free survival, as an endpoint, and some other endpoints there. Next slide. 13 UK centres, so not just Mount Vernon and Liverpool. We allow previous immunotherapy, but we do not allow previous chemotherapy. Okay, next slide. So this is, I think, my last slide, but I do want to just take a minute stressing a couple of things. So hopefully I've made the argument that given that current standard therapies have got very little in terms of significant benefit, that trial options are essential. And I'd argue that trial options are essential both for the individual patient and also just to make progress for the field. I mean, the worst thing that can happen is if you just make decisions based on anecdote, you end up giving people stuff that you have no confidence can make a difference. And that's unfair, and it dashes hopes, and I think it's to be avoided. I think the only reason, I tell my patients this, the only reason to go on a clinical trial is in the hope that it benefits them as an individual. It's not altruism, it's not for the good of the field, it's what is most likely to help them. But by being part of a clinical trial, that's the only way that we can establish whether something is better than what we've currently got. And also the negatives are really important as well. If a trial is negative, then people won't persist giving something that is of no use. And so negatives are as important as positives. Now, if you've got a disease that's really difficult to treat and refractory, maximising treatment options is really important. So the reality is that there's only a small chance of any one of the things that I've described helping somebody, but it may be that one of them will. So therefore, a strategy that allows maximum choices is obviously in an individual patient's best interest. So we were explicit about this when we were writing the guidelines. We were explicit about it when people were presenting with their primary disease, that they should be given all options and be told what was available at the different centres around the UK, and it equally applies to patients with advanced disease. So I do get upset sometimes. I get upset when I hear of patients who have been given advice to go for something where I know the evidence base may not be great, and by doing that something, it's screwed up their options to get onto other trials. So what I feel strongly about is that there should be an initial discussion with, or a referral to, an oncologist. I think it needs to be an oncologist with a specialist interest who can map out a treatment strategy. And that's the conversation that I have with patients when I see them first out. So it depends, obviously, on a number of things. Where their disease is. Is it all confined in the liver or not? Have they only got a little bit outside the liver? What their performance status is? What their history is? Are there reasons that they can't have immunotherapy? What's the pace of their disease? What's their appetite for travelling around the country and going on these things? So there are multifactorial elements to this. But what you try to do is to map out a strategy that keeps as many options open, knowing what the inclusion and exclusion criteria are on the trials. Because otherwise, it would be a great shame if somebody just does the first thing that's available, but it means that they won't have access to something that potentially could help them because of the inclusion and exclusion criteria in an area that is really just starting to make progress. Okay, thank you.
it's a really difficult talk to have to give. In an ideal world, we'd all have bespoke treatment for every single one of us that is absolutely tailored based on a huge evidence base out there with lots of different options. But uveal melanoma is still so far from that point, and it's until we've got the trial evidence, until we can really strongly say this is the right option for you. At the moment, I think trials are certainly the best way forward for the majority of patients. Can I ask you, Paul, just how many oncologists do you think, that medical oncologists, do you think there are in the UK who've got a specialist interest in uveal melanoma?
I think the UK is better placed than most territories, I have to say that. So what we'd learned was that we were able to do trials in the UK within the NCRI, or led by the National Cancer Research Institute Clinical Study Group. And the reason we were able to do that is we've got functional relationships between the melanoma specialists around the country, so people refer in. So for instance, locally in my parish, Mark Middleton is in Oxford. He's an internationally well-known melanoma expert. But Mark sends me all his eye melanoma patients because he knows that it's just more sensible for things to be centralized when you've got rare diseases. There's probably, there are 10 or 15, I don't know, when I say high ranking, I mean internationally recognized melanoma oncologists in the UK. And there are probably 6 or 7 of us that have got a track record in uveal melanoma when it comes to publications. I'm interested to hear what Neil and Christian say about that, but that sort of level.
Do you think there would be something that we could, I mean, our members are always keen to know who's the right person to get referred to.
Yeah.
Is it possible, do you think, to put a list together?
I think it would be. It's been touched on before, and I think Neil, who's going to be talking later on, has suggested, Neil Stephen from Birmingham has suggested something along similar lines, and I think that would be very reasonable.
Any questions? Oh, over there. Yeah.
I've forgotten which drug it was, but one of them said you had to have had an immune therapy beforehand.
Yeah.
Why is that? Because presumably that would have failed.
Yeah.
Be going on.
Yeah. So it's a good illustration of the kind of multi-elements to the different pressures on drug development that influence these sorts of decisions. So that stipulation was by the FDA, which is the US Drug Licensing Authority. And so the FDA told Immunocore, with the IMC GP100 drug, that they wanted outcomes in a group of patients who had previously been treated with an immune checkpoint inhibitor. The reason they did that is because even though the data shows only 5% of patients may have some benefit, because that they are licensed, in the States at least, many patients are being offered those drugs with uveal melanoma. Of course, 95% of them will have no benefit from it. But the FDA wanted Immunocore to demonstrate whether in that group of patients their drug was active. The mechanism is entirely different. So just because a patient has failed on pembrolizumab, it doesn't mean that they're going to fail on IMC GP100, because the drugs work in very different ways. But I think it's not a robust quality requirement. It's a requirement by the FDA. I think it could be criticised. It's one of the reasons that we've been pressurising Immunocore to try and open up the entry criteria on that expansion phase, which they will be doing.
Thank you, Paul. Can we have one more question? Sorry.
Could I ask you about the IMC GP100 trial that you're involved in?
Yeah.
Just wondering, do you have any more information that you could give us in relation to the outcomes for people, say the numbers involved, and maybe the sites and location for those people, and the overall response rate for them?
Yeah. So I
know phase 1 is
yeah.
explain that well, but
The data, there isn't a formal update over and above the data that we presented at ASCO in Chicago in the summer. It's not long ago, so it is a recent data cutoff. So I showed you the waterfall plots and the swimmers plots. Some of those responses are still proving to be durable. So in other words, we've got patients who are having responses lasting over a year, which is why there's a lot of interest around the drug. There isn't. I haven't got any more numbers for you. The trial's ongoing at the moment.
Okay, Christian's not quite ready, are you? So one more question. Yeah, down here at the front, so far away.
In the first two trials, I think you mentioned that they were more than just the UK, presumably to try and drive up numbers. I'm not going to pronounce it correctly,
Yeah.
but the other one, you talked about 13 centres in the UK.
Yeah.
Is it also international? And I guess my question is, should more of these try and be international to get to numbers?
Yeah, really good.
Actually end up with a result sooner rather than
Yeah, absolutely.
to appear and get registered?
That's a really good question. So the general point is that with rare trials, we particularly need to collaborate. So there's something called the International Rare Cancer Initiative that and it's specifically for rare tumours that require multi-territorial studies to proceed. There is a uveal melanoma group. It's chaired by Rich Carvajal from New York. I'm the UK rep on that, and we meet and discuss development of trials. In fact, CELPAC, the Selumetinib study, is now an ERKI study because we've opened a site in Berlin. So for all the reasons that you said. So yes, that's very much up in our mind.
Okay. Are you ready now, Christian?
Technically challenged, sorry.
Is it a technical challenge that needs another question? Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. Really fantastic.